Well, good morning, and thank you very much for joining this live Infrastructure Victoria webinar on water infrastructure in a changing climate. I'm really pleased to welcome you to it, and of course I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we're meeting today, and also of course the owners of the waters that we're going to be talking about today. I'm in Melbourne at the Infrastructure Victoria offices, so we're on Wurundjeri country, and I'd like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the lands and waters on which we're meeting, and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and any who might be with us today. Now, we are going to have a really lively conversation today covering all sorts of aspects of water infrastructure in a changing climate. And I'd encourage you to post your questions as well. And some have already come through. And if you have a look at the Slido chat function that is on the screen where you're viewing this, please feel free to put your questions in there, and we'll try to cover those during the conversation as well. So let me introduce the star lineup of panelists that we've assembled this morning. We have Nerina de Lorenzo. Nerina is the Managing Director of Melbourne Water. Also with us is Tracey Slatter, and Tracey is the Managing Director of Barwon Water. And Jo Lim, who is the CEO of VicWater, which is the organisation that represents all the water businesses across Victoria. So I couldn't think of a better lineup to be discussing water infrastructure in a changing climate this morning. So let's get started. And I can't help noticing as I was riding to work this morning, I got pretty wet. It's raining outside, our catchments are full. There's news stories about there's going to be flooding and to prepare for the next few days. So why are we worrying about water? I might start with you, Nerina. When we look ahead about climate change projections, what does that actually mean for our water supplies and the infrastructure that we need to plan into the coming decades?
Well, thank you, Jonathan. And I think we live in such interesting times, don't we, as we look out the window and talk about water security for the long term. It's a really interesting story. Over the last 20 years, we've seen a gradual reduction in stream flows, you know, the water that comes from rivers, which is the predominant water source for Melbourne. But it's not smooth. We've seen that gradual reduction. 16 out of the last 20 years it's been reducing, but it's bumpy. And so we're currently in an event that's a La Nina event where there's a lot more rainfall than normal. It's the third one in a row. That's only happened 4 times since records began. That's how rare that is, but we're right in the middle of it now. And while that's happening now, it means we obviously need to manage that, but we can't take our eyes off the long term. And the long term and the trend that we're experiencing is a gradual reduction of stream flows. And what's been happening, I think, to help augment that, to work our way through that, is really looking at a whole range of things like, reduction in the way we're using water, which has happened quite a lot in Melbourne, which is, run quite a long course, as well as other, augmenting it through other sources, in particular for Melbourne, the desal. So currently, we're using about 70 gigalitres of water more than what's coming into our stream flows. That's the long-term trend that we've been seeing. And currently, that's what the desal plant's topping up. It's been on since 2017. And in the long term, what we see is a continuing of that trend. And so that is the long-term future that we're thinking about and planning for. And it comes about as a result of both rainfall, but also population growth. And when you do project that out for the long term, we're looking, at 50-year time horizons. We're really talking about, between making sure we've got potable water for Melbourne, as well as water in our rivers and traditional owner water. When you consider all of those needs, we're really looking at something like a doubling of our water supplies over the next 50 years. So that's the long-term trend. But obviously, when you look out the window today, we've got an unusual event. And when that happens, we manage and we capture as much as we can, but also we keep planning for that long-term future.
Thanks, Nerina. And Joe, I might go to you next. Nerina's described that projections. One of the things it will be useful to hear from you about is how the changing climate might have different impacts for different water businesses across the state, because of course that's what VicWater represents. So how are the challenges of the changing climate for water infrastructure likely to play out a little differently in different places?
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. So, I mean, what we're seeing across the state is really what we're seeing in Melbourne as well. So that continued, the impacts of climate change, the long-term forecasts around less water being available. And then what's interesting is the population side of it. Pandemic has really changed the way that population has been distributed across Victoria, and we saw obviously during the height of the pandemic, lots of people leaving Melbourne and going out to regional areas, which has caused the water corporations in those areas to have to rethink their growth strategies, understand what the population looks like over the next few years, and then long term. I mean, are we going to see people move back to Melbourne eventually once sort of pandemic has receded into the distance? So that's created now some uncertainty, I think, for some of our regional water corporations in terms of their planning. But the issues around the availability of water and the need to diversify our water sources are all the same, definitely. And the government recently released the Central Gippsland and Central Regions Sustainable Water Strategy, or the SWUS as we refer to it, which covers basically the southern half of Victoria. And the forecast there is that we're going to need an extra 200 gig of water over the next 10 years to meet the water demands, not just of cities and towns, of drinking water for people, but also water for agriculture, water for environment, and water for traditional owners as well, which is very important too.
Thanks, Joe. Yeah, so we've got these challenges across the state, and as is the case with lots of infrastructure planning, slightly different demands depending upon where the population grows and the need to integrate our infrastructure planning with that population and land use. So it sounds very familiar to me at Infrastructure Victoria with the challenges we face. One of the things Infrastructure Victoria's 30-year infrastructure strategy recommended is that to address some of these challenges that Nerina and Joe have been talking about, is that we progress looking at all sorts of potential forms of water use, in particular recycled water and stormwater. And we've had quite a few questions coming through from the audience already about the capacity to reuse water, reuse stormwater, and not simply discharge it, but rather use it for agriculture. Tracey, I might turn to you next. You, Barwon Water, are doing some interesting things in terms of recycling and reuse of water. Tell us a bit about progress that's being made about using all potential water sources.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. And look, I think it's really important to emphasise that we are, across all of our reservoirs, a significant reduction in inflows when we look at average flows. And I think it's hard psychologically when it's raining to appreciate that. But as Nerina said, we're going through these really quite volatile times, and the next drought may be just around the corner. It may be longer and harder than ones we've had before. And I think that's why water corporations plan over a 50-year horizon and do a lot of modelling on the different trends. And we've recently conducted a very extensive engagement with our customers and community, with thousands of conversations to explore all of the different options. And we really were open to it, and we listened to everyone's ideas. And 600 different ideas came through the community, and we explored the cost-benefit analysis of them at a high level, and then narrowed those down to 25 actions that we're taking. And you're spot on that includes not only being more efficient with water, being smarter with the water that we have, but utilising stormwater and recycled water far more. Now, and a good example of that is that we are developing what we're calling an alternative recycled water grid in our region, which will see recycled water being used for fit for purpose right across our region in intensive agriculture. Purple pipe systems, which is that dual pipe, are going into new developments to ensure that a garden and toilet use, for example, is not using high quality drinking water, but well treated, good quality recycled water. So we're quite ambitious about that. We've made some good progress. A lot of the wines that you drink on the Bellarine, from the Bellarine Peninsula, are produced with our recycled water. We have a target for 100% of our water to be recycled by 2030. Now, just zoning in a bit, we're working closely with the North and West, with the City of Greater Geelong on the North and West Geelong growth area. Geelong is one of Australia's fastest growing cities. We're going to see a doubling of our population over the next couple of decades, with 110, as part of that, 110,000 people moving into to Geelong. And we are designing that completely differently to how we would have designed these new developments in the past. And we are taking a whole of water cycle approach and joining up with the City of Greater Geelong. We're not responsible for stormwater. We're not sort of just drawing up the shutters and saying, well, that's nothing to do with us. We're working collaboratively with the city. And together we are designing that new development, the 110,000 people, to be a net exporter of water. We're going to use all of those technologies to be able to capture the water, whether it's storm water, whether it's recycled water, turn that back into the environment to make that city a green, vibrant place of well-being, also to make sure that every household has access to recycled water, but will then take the excess water from the development that it doesn't need and treat it through a series of swales and other biological processes, natural processes, and in the future, that water, particularly the storm water, could be reused through indirectly back through the system, whether that be in the recycled water network or through the potable network. So that's what we're planning for the future. And it is, as I said, an integrated water management approach, completely different to how we would have approached these developments in the past.
Thanks, Tracey. That's a really exciting and progressive way to do that future planning. How about you, Nerina, in Melbourne Water? What sort of approach are you taking to sort of diversity of water supplies and a portfolio of water supply options?
I think it's on a few levels. I mean, one at a macro level is really thinking about how you develop up your different bulk options. But I sort of want to build on, there were a few really important elements from what Tracey was talking about there. You know, this notion of having a broader set of water options really means we have to think about the system in a much more integrated way. And we've got to work in a much closer way with other partners, because these different water sources, they're all governed a little bit differently. So, for example, if you want to make more use of stormwater, you need to be much more closely connected with your local governments. If we're going to really, on a place-by-place basis, draw out some of the different, reuse of different types of water sources, we've also got to work wholesalers and retailers together. There's actually quite a lot of, really drawing that important point out from what Tracey was talking about, that integrated partnership between multiple bodies to do this. And so the example I'll offer along those lines is for Melbourne Water, we're working with Greater Western Water and Hume City Council on the Sunbury project. We know that over the next 20 years, Sunbury will double in size, and we've been doing quite a lot of engagement with together with our partners to work through and develop an integrated water management plan, which will make greater use of stormwater and other recycled water sources in fit-for-purpose, applications. But again, it draws, this infrastructure of the future is, thinking more broadly about portfolios of infrastructure, but also partnering much more closely with local government and with partners generally, because it's going to need a much more integrated approach. So I just wanted to draw that out because I thought that was a really important point that Tracey was illustrating before. And I think that's a really critical theme, I think, in terms of adaptation to climate change. It's going to call on that from all of us, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jo, when you look across the state to the use of all potential water sources, there's obviously been quite a bit of progress made, which Tracey and Nerina have just been describing. Are there any barriers that remain in terms of their ability to use a sort of broad range of options for recycled and other forms of water in the broader portfolio of all water supply sources?
Well, that's an interesting question. Barriers. Look, I think that, it's safe to say that, all water corporations are embarking on projects, in the same way that Melbourne Water is and Barwon Water is, around integrated water management and pursuing those collaborative approaches. And it's something that we're very proud of in our sector, that we do have such a collaborative mindset across all 18 of us. We share IP, we share knowledge, we collaborate on different projects, we do technology trials, etc. And we're really keen to extend that collaboration out to be cross-sectoral, as Nerina has said, with local government in particular. And there's different ways that we're trying to do that, and we might touch on that later in the conversation, particularly around circular economy. It's that understanding that we are all connected, and as public sector entities, we're all here for the benefit of the state and for Victorians generally. And so it really behoves us to work together to achieve those outcomes.
Yeah, thanks, Jo. And speaking of working together, so one of the things that Infrastructure Victoria recommended is that there be greater clarity about which organisations and departments are responsible for major infrastructure upgrades for water, because we'd done research that showed there was not always clear. And it's been really positive to see in the SWUS, as you were describing before, Jo, the new sustainable water strategy, a new approach to this, where there's a readiness approach and a water grid plan. Perhaps, Nerina, would you be able to expand a bit upon this change to how major investment planning is going to be done, and how this is likely to roll out in the next few years?
Well, here is my copy that arrived yesterday. So I think this is the sign of a water nerd, is holding your SWUS copy close. But effectively, the shift, I guess, is recognising that we need to have a posture of readiness. We know that infrastructure takes many years to develop and deliver. And so what's being taken, I think, in the SWUS and also collectively across all of the water corps and we've dealt together, is the notion of adaptive planning. So basically having a number of ways forward that you start to think about and you develop your readiness for. And one of the issues, obviously, is making sure we're clear, well, who is taking forward what part of readiness? Who's thinking about how the network needs to, accommodate different water sources, for example, because if you have water coming from multiple sources, your network has to work differently. And so part of what's been great through the SWUS process has been drawing the different parties together to get a better understanding of our respective roles and to set up, mechanisms for future work that helps us identify, well, what kinds of readiness work needs to happen next, and who's doing those packages, who's doing what to help us move it forward. And so it's set up a great framework to move that forward and to do it in a really thoughtful, steady way and in an adaptive way, because, we need to think long term, we need to be ready for the long term, but also, we're responding to changing climatic conditions, and they change very quickly. Anyone who looks out the window will see that. And so that, I think, approach in the SWUS, I think, has really drawn us much more closely together as partners, and has set up a greater understanding of respective roles and some future, governance arrangements that we can all be part of, and also take our roles up much more clearly. So I think we're on our way to that, Jonathan. Obviously it's something that you've got to keep working on, but we're definitely on our way, and the SWUS process has been a great catalyst, I think, for that.
Yeah, that's really pleasant to hear. So how might this play out with the next big investment, the people of a desal plant, for example? We've got some questions coming through from the audience about this, and I'm not necessarily asking panel members to pick the place and the date, but using this new process, how would a decision about a new desal plant or other major augmentation be likely to flow through in practice?
Well, I'm happy to have the.
Yeah, go ahead.
I'm happy to, and so I'll speak a bit in more conceptual terms.
Yeah.
And so, the comment I made before was about having a portfolio of approaches. We know we need to address what will become a long-term growing deficit, but we also know we've got a range of ways to address that. Having a portfolio of approaches means you basically get yourself ready, you do your thinking work, you do your planning work, you think about how your network needs to change to accommodate multiple options, and with desal as an option. And from a volumes perspective, if we look at the sorts of volumes that we're looking at from a 50-year perspective, you can see that there's going to be a need for multiple options, including really bulk volume options like desal. They're all, somewhere on the table in the next, in this long-term period. So they're all things that we need to be thinking about. And so this approach is basically about developing up and thinking through multiple options at the same time, and regularly looking at, well, what's coming ahead, what's changing. Does that mean we need to trigger moving forward on anything or not? And it's a really thoughtful approach, and it means you're not reacting after the fact. Because the other truth in the transition that we're all making, IWM projects, they take a long time to implement. You can't just turn them over overnight. So to really develop these, for example, IWM projects, we need to be thinking ahead about those, and having this adaptive approach means we can progress them and then see how much we're yielding from each of those projects. And it means we can make the next sensible decisions. So I think that's the beauty of this adaptive planning approach and this portfolio approach, keeping all of your options on the table so that you can make the smartest decision at the right time, and also the most cost-effective decision at the right time.
Mm. And I think a big part of that too, Nerina, is which comes out in this was too, is the importance of ongoing community engagement. And I think a lesson learned from the desal plant that we have now is that community engagement, there was a lot, it was controversial, the community was not brought along very well, and the timing meant that once the desal was commissioned, we didn't actually use it for the first 5 years and no one wanted to talk about it. So all of these things have taught us that we need to be much more mindful going into a future augmentation, that we bring the community along with us, that we've properly explained the need for it, and we've got as much support as possible. And, Tracey touched on this earlier. They've done an incredible amount of community engagement in Barwon Water, as have all other water corporations in developing their price submissions this year, or those who have had to do it this year. So we already have that engagement infrastructure in place. And I think that we can continue to use that to talk about all of these challenges that we have ahead of us.
I think just something I would add to those points, Jonathan, is that it's no longer the case that we can just think about, well, have we got enough water to run through people's taps into their homes and businesses? Climate change is affecting the broader environment, and we're seeing flow-stressed rivers. We're finally recognising the rights of traditional owners to the cultural value of water. The climate is drying in a whole range of ways. So we have a role, I think, to look at water far more holistically, and to see how we can work together, more innovatively, to not only secure urban water supplies, but to do so in a way that also enables the return of water back to rivers and back to traditional owners.
Yeah, and that's been a very strong theme that's come through also in the new water strategy as well.
Mm.
While we're talking infrastructure, a couple of questions that have come through from audience members has been about how we plan or design the infrastructure for water to take account of increasing risk of both floods and droughts, and that the adaptability of that infrastructure over time. How's that playing out for you and your businesses, Nerina and Tracey? And Jo, what are you seeing across the industry in terms of any changes around the actual water infrastructure design to be more adaptive and deal with more extreme conditions?
Well, from a Melbourne Waters perspective, so the more extreme conditions mean that they can impact, water supply lines. They can impact our catchments. I don't know if people remember, but there was a really big storm last year that there was a massive downpour in the Thomson catchment, and it churned up quite a lot of the landscape. And so there were lots of measures to be taken to make sure we limited the amount of flow into water supply during, it was around an 8-week period while the landscape recovered. So, there are examples of we need to be building more resilience, and we're working on, where are the other places you build further resilience into your water supply system to these events. But they're different. They're different events. People will often say, well, if there are floodwaters coming, how might you capture all of those floodwaters? Well, what you're trying to do is capture them in a steady way over a period of time, because you can't predict exactly where the rain's going to fall. You can't have, you can't have a facility that captures it in every possible part. But what you do over time is you optimise and you work out the best way of managing where water is coming and where water is flowing, and you optimise it. And the big point, I guess, from that is that the rivers and the reservoirs, they're all connected. They're all connected. The dams are connected, and we see it as a whole system, and we're constantly needing to optimise where water is flowing to capture the most of it, but also manage it when it comes in its big quantities, recognising that sometimes when you have really big events, that they're going to be over the top of what any infrastructure can plan for. So then it's a little bit different, which is, well, what are the further measures from a community perspective in terms of resilience to those events, and also the resilience of our system when those events happen, because they're very hard to predict. And, there's a lot of work going into environmental resilience. That is, the further emerging theme over the coming, decade as well.
And I think, we're also looking at more extreme periods of drought and of fire risk. So we're assessing, in addition to those points that Nerina raised, we're also assessing all of our assets in terms of their resilience to those kinds of extremes as well. And one of the things that we are doing is putting in more intelligent sensors, particularly into our sewer network, because both in very wet conditions and in very dry conditions, the sewer network can come under more pressure to sewer spills. And sewer spills into the environment and people's backyards is certainly not something that we want to see. So those intelligent sensors that we've been trialling, we're going to roll out many thousands more of them in years, aim to sort of detect pressure changes in the sewer network and enable our people to undertake more planned maintenance in a proactive way that will help to deal with those additional pressures coming on the system. And then even when we think about bushfire risk, a number of our significant assets are in the Otways, in towns that are at high risk of bushfire, and we've had to think really differently about how we can run those assets autonomously without personnel actually needing to be there. And so we've put in a lot more instrumentation and systems to be able to have those run remotely, but in a safe way. But also it gets down to even very small things like assessing whether there are any rubber or plastic flanges or fittings in some of our networks, because all it would take is for one of those to say melt, for example, and you would lose water supply. So we really have to get right down into the micro details to be able to ensure that the essential services that we provide can be relied upon as we deal with more volatile climate conditions.
Yeah, from the macro to the micro, that's a big task, but and one that will need to happen obviously over a number of years too, as you design and replace and maintain the infrastructure. How about from your perspective, Jo? What are you seeing across the state in terms of design approaches and adaptability in the face of climate change?
So this comes back to my earlier point about collaboration across our industry. So VicWater hosts a program called Intelligent Water Networks, which most of our water corporations are members of, and that is really a vehicle for trialling a lot of the technology that Tracey was talking about, which really helps to optimise our assets and make our asset management more efficient. And so she mentioned remote sensors. There's leak detection and things that we can now do remotely. So all of those things water corporations are trialling and then deploying within their businesses to really help with that design and then ongoing maintenance of assets.
Great, thanks, Jo. Tracey, just a question back to you again while we're on, before we move off the details of water infrastructure. You talked before about some of the integrated water management approaches that are being taken in new developments. Some questions have been coming through from the audience about retrofitting IWM and recycled water and these sorts of things to existing locations. Tell us a bit about both the opportunities and the challenges in retrofitting these approaches to existing suburbs.
Yeah, I do think the retrofitting challenge is significantly greater for us, and it mainly comes down to the cost effectiveness of those interventions. Not quite in the integrated water management space, but there are some things that do make sense, and one of them is digital meters. A number of water corps are rolling out digital meters, and the benefit of this is that customers can get real-time information about their water usage and be able to detect leaks. We've recently run a trial with the Birregurra community, and even in that very small community, they've been able to save thousands of megalitres of water just through good leak detection, and then we will support them in helping to address those leaks. Many people don't realise that they've got leaks. They're not sort of things that are causing great floods in their house or in their gardens. So this digital technology can really help with that. In addition to that, water efficient devices make a huge difference in our region, and I think it's similar across Melbourne especially. Our peak water use, in other words, the water that we sell, occurred in 1982. And in that, since 1982, of course, we've had significant population growth, we've had droughts, we've had floods. But why are we using less water now than we did back? Why are we selling less water now than back in 1982? It's largely to do with more efficient uses of water in homes and in businesses. More water efficient appliances make a huge difference. And so these are the sort of changes that there is still further to go, and we obviously provide programs and assistance to our communities. But when it comes to things like putting rainwater tanks on the houses that have already been developed, or putting purple pipes into existing developments, unfortunately, from a system-wide point of view, it doesn't really, it isn't the most cost-effective intervention. I'll put a water tank into my house at home. I can assure you it was quite expensive. yes, it's saving me a small amount of money, but it's not the sort of thing that most people can afford, and it's not a good investment from our customers' point of view to be doing across the board.
Yeah, thanks, Tracey. And that sort of analysis about return on investment is certainly consistent with the conclusions we've drawn at Infrastructure Victoria as well. Let's now move to the synergies that exist between the water sector and other sectors. We're increasingly seeing in addressing climate change that we're getting synergies between different sectors and also sharing of challenges too. And we're seeing this in transport and energy and recycling and water. And of course, there's some really interesting both challenges and opportunities with energy use by the water sector, which can be quite energy intensive traditionally, but also some big opportunities both for the water corporations and their customers. Nerina, would you like to start off in terms of how Melbourne Water is approaching this? And then I know, Tracey, you're doing some really interesting projects in Barwon Water, which we should talk about too.
It's a really interesting area, and philosophically, there's a sort of philosophical shift that's, I think, happened over a long period of time, but really coming into its own now about recognising how much resource recovery can happen from waste process, and also from the utilisation of this the resources that we manage. It's really actually beautiful and amazing to see how that's progressing. And so for Melbourne Water, it's things like we've got mini hydros at around 14 sites. We generate biogas from our two treatment plants. We've been, building solar in a whole range of sites at Melbourne Water and really ramping that up. And we're really exploring some of those, next edge uses and thinking about, well, what else can happen with resource recovery and with the type of renewable energy generation technologies that could be developed. For example, starting to think more broadly about, what are the hydrogen opportunities in the long term? What are the further biogas opportunities? And so that's a place that we are entering further and really, starting to bridge towards some partners to be thinking more about that. Our focus has been really trying to generate as much as we can to power a lot of our own work. We can generate enough to cover around 40% of our own needs just through that. And we've been looking to expand that, but more recently we've really been thinking more broadly around, well, what are the other long-term renewable energy options, and starting to explore some of those exciting opportunities. So early days still for us, we're still working our way through, but ultimately really taking a different lens on what you can do with the resources that we're managing, but also the resource recovery that can happen through the waste system.
Thanks, Nerina. And Tracey, tell us a bit more about what's happening in Barwon Water and the Barwon region more broadly.
Yeah, thanks, Jonathan. Look, most people think of water businesses as water businesses, but in fact, waste and waste recovery and the circular economy is actually a bigger or a very significant part of water corporations. And we are, as you said, unfortunately significant contributors to greenhouse gas emissions. And that's because two factors significantly. One is that pumping water and sewerage around is incredibly energy intensive. But secondly, of course, there are fugitive emissions from the wastewater treatment process, particularly methane and nitrous oxide, both of which are far more significant contributors than carbon dioxide. So we've got a really big challenge on our hand, and it's one that the water sector, I think, has strongly leant into. At Barwon Water, we've set a goal of being 100% renewable by 2025, and I'm pleased to say that we've already achieved that. And that's with a portfolio of initiatives that have leveraged our infrastructure and the way that we work in completely different ways. We've got a 3 megawatt solar farm. We've got battery and solar at a different one of our treatment plants. We have a mini hydro. But I think more significantly than this, we've really thought about the power of poo, of sewage. And at Colac, we have partnered up with the Australian Land Company and Bulla Cream, and we've changed the relationship with them. Instead of them having to spend a lot of money treating their organic waste before they discharged it to sewer, we've now reprogrammed our system, and they can put high-strength organic waste straight down the sewer. That's saving them money. We are then capturing the gas from that, and then through a cogen, turning that into renewable electricity. That electricity is now running that Colac water reclamation plant completely off the grid, and we're able at peak times to actually put some energy back into the grid. And also, as a next stage, we are heating hot water from that renewable energy and returning that to the Australian Land Company, and that will reduce significantly their use of gas to heat hot water. So, capturing that gas, instead of it releasing into the atmosphere, capturing it and turning it to good, and at the same time producing economic benefit for those two significant companies is really, I think, the way of the future for water corps. And as a second stage of that, we have recently signed long-term agreements with councils in our region. As they roll out the 4-bin system under Victoria's Recycling Victoria policy agenda, the green organics, both the organics from the garden and the food waste, we will be taking that to our Black Rock water reclamation plant, combining that with our own biosolids and producing both biogas for the energy to run that plant, again, with renewable energy. But more importantly than that, we'll be producing a product called biochar. And biochar is a fantastic product because its process of development actually eliminates the contaminants that are in those products. It locks the carbon away, so you have a product that is pure carbon. That carbon can then be sequestered into the agricultural soils of our region, help to replace the chemical fertilisers. It helps to retain water in the soil, and again contributing to the economy by growing jobs in our region, both through the production of that biochar, but also in its productive value in agriculture in our region. So the water sector has a long history in the circular economy, but because of our infrastructure, because of our capability, because of the products that we have, there's a long way to go. And of course, hydrogen is a massive opportunity. We've recently partnered with Viva Energy. We are supplying recycled. We'll be supplying them with treated recycled water for their hydrogen facility, for their new energy service station, which will enable trucks in our region to be able to run on hydrogen. So the water sector, of course, has a very significant role to play in hydrogen, because if that hydrogen can be produced with recycled water, then we're not competing with the important resource of potable water. So just such a significant role for the water sector to play. And I think while we're a long way down the track, the opportunities are very significant indeed.
Thanks, Tracey. I mean, they're obviously huge opportunities, and it's great to see some of that going from theory to practice and implementation, and really well aligned with some of the work that we've done in Infrastructure Victoria, actually, on both recycling and resource recovery. And our most recent advice we provided government on the gas transition, where what we've called out is that this is the decade for us to be trialling development of biogas and hydrogen and proving it up in terms of a practical and economic sense, so that it sets us up well in coming decades as we reduce our reliance on natural gas. And it's great to hear the opportunities that provides, both for water corps themselves, but also your customers and the circular economy. And Jo, I'd really be interested to hear about, the story that Tracey's telling about what's happening in Barwon water. How are you seeing this play out in other water corps across Victoria?
Yeah, so we've been doing some work lately with the department, DELP, to really try and forefront the role of the water sector and water corporations in the circular economy. In some ways, we're quiet achievers. So all of the things that Nerina and Tracey were talking about perhaps were not very well known outside of our sector, and we were concerned that maybe opportunities that are there, particularly for the local government sector, were not well known. So we've been working with the department to raise awareness and to, try and see if we can replicate some of the work that certainly Barwon Water has been doing in working with local councils and entering into those long-term agreements. As state-owned entities ourselves, we're reliable. We can make those kinds of long-term investments, so it provides more resilience in the organics recycling market generally. So that's what we're trying to do as a sector. Of course, all water corporations individually have their own plans and own business models and are doing slightly different things. I mean, for example, Gippsland Water is the largest composting facility in the state. So they've gone down a slightly different path, but it's all part of the circular economy, and it all highlights the important role that we have as a water sector.
Absolutely. And it's that connection between the sector and the community, of course, and it relates to, social license that the water sector has to operate as well. Jo, you were talking in some earlier comments about engagement with the community, and what I'd really like you to do is now talk a bit about the broader role that the community has as we shape up the water sector for climate change and being prepared for that, and what the role that the community can play in, saving water, which of course we've done in the past, but also improving waterways and increasingly, what's the opportunity for the community to inform decision making about the water sector and water infrastructure.
Yes, well, so those of us who lived in Melbourne and Victoria during the Millennium Drought, of course, would be very familiar with the Target 155 campaign, which was in Melbourne, and then I think in regional areas it was more Target Your Water Use, but it was, similar sort of campaign, and that was hugely successful at the time, and in fact, Melburnians' water use, and correct me if I'm wrong, has only just gone back up to 159 or 161, something around there. So we brought down water use significantly during the drought, and then it has only sort of bumped up just a little bit. So that would suggest that we embedded a lot of water saving behaviours during that time that have really held, although there is perhaps a question mark over younger generations who didn't live through that drought and whether they have that same level of understanding. So there's probably a bit of work to do there. I know that the Metro Water Corporations ran a campaign in the summer of 2019. That's the last time that I'm aware anyway that some market research was done around people's understanding of water efficiency and water savings and their willingness to change behaviours, shaving a minute off your shower, turning the taps off when you brush your teeth, not using your hose to water down your driveway, those kinds of things. So that's now going back 2 or 3 years. And of course, in the meantime, we've had La Nina events, 3 of them. And so it's, as Nerina said, it's difficult to talk about water security or water saving when it's absolutely pouring with rain seemingly all the time. So that's a sort of a mismatch, I guess, that we will need to be very conscious of and getting over in terms of the messaging that goes out to the community around campaigns that we run in future. It's all good now, but it can change very quickly, and our storages could drop 40% in the next 5 years if we don't continue to get rainfall. So I think and in any case, water efficiency will only do so much to solve our water problems. So we can't load it all on people to say that, if you don't have 4-minute showers, that's going to be the reason why we don't have water. That's not true. So it is about being realistic with our messages too, and being open and honest and transparent with people. And I think that's how we gain the community trust. And you mentioned social license before, and that's really important for us to hold and continue to hold. But there's a variety of different. It's not just residential either. I mean, there's programs that go on in schools, the schools water efficiency program as well. There's campaigns directed towards industry and commercial business too. So they're all part of the puzzle as well.
Yeah, thanks, Jo. And Nerina, turning to Melbourne Water, what are you doing in terms of engaging with your community and customer base, which of course is very large, to inform your investments and your policies?
Well, at a number of levels. Obviously, during our price submission time, we would do that on bulk, but we run a program that is particularly focused around, waterways. We spend a lot of time with much high level of community contact and co-design around, particularly some of the Reimagining Your Creek projects on a sort of place basis, and really engaging with local communities to both improve waterway health and, do all of the sort of IWM projects that we do, and to do it with a really strong philosophy of co-design with communities who really care for the place. And it's actually quite an amazing program to just see place by place as we've been running that, alongside of the macro sorts of consultation and discussion that we have when it comes to the sort of bulk management of the system, that really beautiful care that people have for the place they live in, and to be able to do that on a place-by-place basis, and then be able to see the outcomes that are delivered on the ground absolutely influenced by, the community groups who live there and then care for the place going forward. That's been an amazing, set of programs that has been run over the last few years. So it's things like reimagining, the Blind Creek, and also reimagining Moonee Ponds Creek, which is currently about removing concrete that has been there for a long time and renaturalising sections of the creek. And they're just examples of those, great community engagement opportunities where people can genuinely influence the design of what happens on the ground.
And I've heard, Nerina, that you've had real success, particularly in engaging with culturally diverse communities in that way. So that's been a really good way of perhaps building those relationships with your cultural and linguistically diverse customers too. Those communities.
Absolutely. And it's interesting because it's the filter in those projects is place. It's not, this is a water project. It's actually, this is about the place that people have a connection with. And so again, it is really, connecting water as this underpinning support to life, but doing it in a way that really connects to community values and really partnering in a different way as well.
Yeah, that's great to hear. Now, turning to our audience for a moment, I've got a favour to ask you all. We now have a very short poll available in the next few minutes before we finish up this webinar to tell us what you thought about this webinar. We'd love to hear from you. It's just a couple of questions, and we'll find it really helpful to improve our future events. And feel free to let us know if there's any other things you'd like to see us cover in webinars in the future. Turning back to our discussion, one of the questions that's come through has been around engagement with traditional owners. And we touched on that earlier, so let's get into that in a little bit more depth. Love to hear from panel members about how you're engaging with traditional owners around water and water infrastructure. and also what that practically is going to mean both for your businesses and for traditional water owners and users.
I'm happy to kick that off.
Thanks, Tracey.
I think this has been a fundamental shift for us at Barwon Water, and I suspect for the water sector more generally. We have worked to build much stronger relationships with the two traditional owner groups in our region, the Wadawurrung and the Eastern Maar. All of our staff have participated in cultural awareness training, and that includes spending time on country with traditional owners and hearing from them about what water means to them and the land and the environment within which we work. And I think it's really shifted the mindset of our people significantly, and particularly not to see water just as a resource, but to see it as a living thing and as part of the natural environment. And that might seem sort of obvious to other people, but in the water business, you know, it's largely engineers. They're thinking about how do we get enough of this water at the right price for the right people at the right time, and to step back from that mindset and to understand that we are working on country, the waters, the land, the skies, the animals. It's all part of a very important and the oldest living culture in the world. And we have such a privilege, I think, to learn from that. And it is changing how we work in our operations, and it's helping us to have a much broader view and perspective than we had in the past. And even really small things. So we're starting to engage with the traditional owners on how we build our infrastructure and where we build our infrastructure. And we were building a pump station out at Lara, something that we do all the time in new developments. And you know, the team had an idea about where it would go. And the Wadawurrung came out and said, you're building it right in the view line of the Yuyangs. You know, and you just feel like an idiot. You know, why didn't we see that ourselves? And so obviously we changed the location of that. So, you know, in small and more significant and profound ways, I think, you know, there's real opportunities in the future. And one of our pieces of land that hasn't had anything sort of in particular happen on it, along the Barwon River, 66 hectares of land there where a disused aqueduct is running across the river there. We're working in partnership with the Wadawurrung to develop that land as a place of cultural significance for the whole community to enjoy, a parkland that will be completely different to how it would have been developed had we just you know, done it the same way that we do other things, you know, engage an architect and come up with a plan, consult with the community and get on with it. So this will be developed using Wadawurrung cultural practices and be a very different resource and place for the community to enjoy for years to come. So it is having a really significant impact.
Thanks, Tracey. A couple of really great practical examples too. So yeah, that's really good to hear. How about you, Nerina? How's this playing out for Melbourne Water?
Very similarly in that absolute, you know, really fundamental shift in the way we're thinking and taking a step back to walk together and to learn. I think that's been the really key shift that we've been seeing. And the quote that sort of really encompasses it for me is that if water is healthy, country is healthy, and if country is healthy, people are healthy. And so that absolute connection is just so ingrained in terms of the traditional owner cultures and what we can learn. And two really practical ways. So, you know, management of water health and management of country health. You know, the Yarra strategic plan has been a really important, you know, breakthrough piece of work really about the health of the Birrarung. And that's been work with Wurundjeri and Bunurong traditional owner corporations. And Melbourne Water is, you know, the lead coordinating agency, but working with so many agencies to now lift and protect and recognise the significance of the Yarra. So that's one sort of example of that really moving forward in a really different way and a much closer way and with a real learning lens. And the other one is fire management practices. We've been working much more closely together to learn and to undertake cultural fire management practices that complement a whole range of the programs that help us manage country well together. And so, the way we've sort of been framing it is walk country together and undertake the learning process and recognise that there is a lot to learn here and that there's much more integration of the way we do the work that we're doing. And it's, it will take a long time to build that further knowledge, but we are really, really seeing great breakthroughs. We've just signed our first partnership agreement with the Gunai Kurnai, which are the traditional owners who are located where the Thompson Dam is. And so it's now even starting to explore that question of how water moves through country. What might we need to understand about that and the significance of that? And are there things that, maybe weren't in our minds because we were thinking about it purely as an infrastructure project or purely as an infrastructure issue that, really broaden the type of benefits we can get from the work we're doing. So, we're really enriching the way this work is being done through that connection. And, I think we're going to see some amazing things come from it.
Yeah, what strikes me about what you've all described throughout this discussion today is that integrated long-term thinking that we need to have, that which traditional owners have had, and that we're now increasingly starting to apply as we plan for a changing climate, be it very wet like it is right now, or much drier conditions as predicted in the future, and that integrated longer-term planning and working with options and triggers is a key element of how we're going to address our future water needs. We could talk about water all day, but we're at time. What I would very much like to do is thank our panellists, Nerina, Tracey and Jo, for their time and insights in sharing all of that with us today. This webinar is going to be recorded and available on the Infrastructure Victoria website. And if you've got any queries about anything that has been raised in this panel today, then please feel to get in touch with us at inquiries@infrastructurevictoria.com.au. And much of the work that Infrastructure Victoria has done is available on our website. And you can also find some of those other strategic documents like the new Central and Gippsland management plans available as well on the DELT website. Really great to see the progress, and it's an issue we're going to need to stay pretty focused on in coming years. So our water infrastructure and planning meets our needs in the face of a changing climate. Thank you all for joining us, and I wish you all a great rest of the day. Goodbye.